In this session, we take a look at environment and society. And I'm joined by George Revill, who is a geographer.
Indeed.
And we've been talking a lot today, George, about how the social sciences give us various methodologies, various different ways of looking at the world and making sense of them. And this is a particularly interesting example because of the way that an environment, which can be viewed from a very scientific perspective, has a completely different way of looking at it when it's interpreted from a social sciences perspective. And I'm very interested in your role as a geographer and to what extent, we can look at environment and society, which, two words with potentially equal weight in this module. How are you sort of taking those two big things and looking at them?
Well, I think I would say that you can't separate them and that in actual fact they're very much intertwined, science and society, and that it's not possible to look at one without the other. In this kind of module, what we're trying to do is we're trying to say there are a whole series of scientific issues related to the present epoch, the present era, which we call the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is a period, some people say it dates from the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century. Some people say that it dates from the beginning of farming 10, maybe 40, 50,000 years ago, and the beginning of human use of fire 40,000 years ago. And other people say, well, actually, it's a key area post-war when we start to use all these synthetic materials, the rise of petroleum and plastics and all these other kind of things, and modern mechanized travel on a global scale. So clearly we have a period in history when humans are a massive influence on the environment around us. And we have all the powers of science, and yet somehow we don't seem to be able to solve those massive problems. And those problems include such things as climate change, a clear one that we all know about, habitat loss and loss of biodiversity as humans monopolise and take over greater areas of the world, and overuse of resources. We're using resources up at unsustainable rates. So if science alone can't solve those, can the social sciences contribute along with science? So it's not so a matter of counterposing one with the other, but seeing how these things can work together to try and address these issues.
So when you say about solving these problems, is it that we're not able to solve them or we will not solve them?
Well, I think that's... Problems transform, issues transform, so the questions we might face 50, 100 years down the line may be very different from those we face today. So we're always going to be somehow in a situation, I think, where there are issues to resolve. Some scientists, for instance, believe that there are technical solutions to the problems of climate change. And it's imaginably possible that that's the case. But whether that's socially and culturally acceptable to us all is a key question. So we need to understand the social, cultural, economic and political sides of life in order to be able to find a science which will address the issues in a kind of holistic sort of way, because simply addressing the immediate scientific problems isn't necessarily enough.
You say that it's almost impossible to separate the two, and that's very much one of the key things within the module. You call it entanglement.
Yes, that's right. So take us as human beings. Yeah. So one key thing of the model is that we would say that the environment is more social than we think, and society is more environmental than we think. So you take us as human beings, we see we are the epitome of society, and yet we are bacteria, we're physical matter, we're mainly water, but we're also cultural, we've been educated, we have relationships with other living beings, human and non-human, we're technological insofar as, I might be wearing contact lenses, for instance, so I have this technological thing which transforms me as a human being. So we're, in all sorts of ways, we are intimately bound up with biological and technological, social and cultural systems in ways that what makes me as a human being is the summation of all those things together, rather than somebody saying, well, I am the essence and spirit of, of being a human being in my head. Because it's not just about in my head. It's about all this other stuff too.
So everything is very much mixed up, and I guess that presents problems with how you might then look at things. So the social science perspective, which takes various different levels of looking at things, different ways of analysing what's happening, gives you different understandings of something. But I guess the difficulty is trying to draw it together.
I think the difficulty is in trying to separate things whilst at the same time keeping them together. So I think that one of the major lessons of this way of working with environment and society together is to think of, well, if human beings are complex combinations of technological, biological and cultural, social, economic entanglements, bits and pieces, relationships, then that goes for other things too. And that when we try to address an issue, we need to recognise that it too is a complex of all sorts of different things, and any intervention we make in that issue may have all sorts of unintended consequences that we weren't expecting. So, for instance, one of the things that's in our module, for example, the new one, DD213, is the example of coal-fired power stations and the idea of entanglements around coal-fired power stations. So, the first block is about fire, and we look at wildfires, and then we look at contained fires, which come from the Industrial Revolution. You put a fire in a box, and it's more efficient, and it burns brighter, and you get more calorific value out of it. Scientifically improved. And we assumed for a very long time that the fire was contained in the box. What we kind of forgot was the box also has a chimney, and that chimney pushes into the atmosphere all sorts of noxious gases. So rather than this being a single entity here, our contained fire is linked to the atmosphere, and once the gases get into the atmosphere, they can travel all over the world, and that has come through the thing we've come to understand as human-induced climate change, come to affect places which are very, very far distant from the very power stations which produce the noxious gases. So I live not very far from a power station, and it's possible that when I see the gases go up into the atmosphere, I also have to remember that thousands of miles away there are islands which are slowly disappearing into the sea because the sea level's rising. Thousands of miles away, there is consequences that are happening on a global scale through very specific local things. And to address problems through this notion of society environment complexity is to try and become more aware of all those ties and interconnections with other things and places.
Like decades ago when they found out about acid rain and how something in one place could be happening in another. But I wondered if we could talk about this whole idea, because sometimes I think when we talk about such big things, you think, what can we do? I can't stop the manufacturing all these coal fires, etc. I can't do anything about that. It may be impacting on me. And there's the sense of who the powerful are and who the powerless are and what we value and who's worth valuing to some extent. But in economics this morning, we were talking about, well, not this morning, this afternoon, we were talking about this whole idea of acting locally and thinking globally, and to what extent small things could have an impact. And we were talking then about choices that we made as consumers and how those may then impact on who was making certain things and how much they were paid, etc. But the other way around, in terms of trying to think, how can I make a small impact on quite a big change? Everyone cares about the environment, it's our future, but sometimes I think one can feel very powerless.
That's very true, and one of the major issues to address in terms of these kind of environmental problems in the Anthropocene is they just seem so colossal. Climate change, habitat loss of the rainforests, loss of key species, degradation of the oceans, or the issue of plastics, which has become so well known recently. These seem such massive issues, and anything we do as individuals or small groups doesn't seem to be able to make any kind of difference. And yet, it is worth remembering, by thinking about society-environment relationships in their complexity, is that things at a specific place can have broader impacts, and that accumulation of lots of small things can have a massive impact. And indeed, groups of people working in specific locations can do something which is both transformative to their own place and to the wider environment. I think one of the examples we use in the module is that of, from a few years ago now, the protesters who went to the power stations and dressed in yellow suits and climbed on trains and made themselves a nuisance, and by doing so raised the issue of how coal-fired power stations and the use of coal as a dirty fuel was one of the major factors in climate change. So by going to these specific locations, it was possible to raise these bigger, broader issues. But this notion of complexity and environment-society relationships also works on a very local level. So, for instance, another example that we use in our module is the example of a group in a little town in the North York Moors, where they had flooding, and where it was decided that they would bring in a group of local people to see what they made of the problem, because the experts, the engineers and the scientists had failed to be able to address this problem at a price point where a flood measures could be made effective. So they brought in some local people and they looked at the scientific evidence with the help of some academics, and they noticed that there was a flaw in the model that the scientists had made, because a particular farmer had made a bridge across a river using an old lorry, old trailer, and that was blocking the river in a way which the scientific model didn't recognise. And that by dealing with that and several other things, they could take their local knowledge and they could actually improve on the kind of knowledge of the scientists and provide a model which would lead to a flood prevention scheme which has been put into effect and has transformed the town. So not only can working locally on these issues affect these bigger issues such as climate change, but local knowledge can also work on the kind of universal knowledge of science and produce specific local solutions which provide answers to questions which we as scientists being dropped in from outside couldn't possibly provide. So there are all sorts of possibilities for using locally based knowledges and locally based action in order to do something bigger. Another thing we do on this module is we also look at citizen science and the role that citizen science plays in producing scientific knowledge which can then impact on broader decision making, national and even international policy.
So tell us about the citizen science, because aside from the sort of activism or getting involved in a local group, etc., some of these ideas are things that somebody can do privately in their own home that actually benefits. I mean, you know, things like Spring Watch, adding collections of things, you know, people are taking photographs of things that are unusual and adding those to databases, building up the scientific knowledge. You know, there are all these things that are happening that can have a massive impact on both the environment in terms of capturing what's happening at various levels and contributing in ways that don't require a lot of money or activism or explicit stances on anything.
I think that's very, very true. I mean, Spring Watch is a perfect example. We're very interested in the role that media plays in our module, instead the role that media plays in figuring environment and nature and environmental issues. And I think Springwatch is a particularly interesting example of how this is being transformed for the current era. I think somebody was saying to us earlier that nobody watches television anymore, and yet programs like Springwatch have a profound influence.
And there was that example about Blue Planet with the plastics.
Oh, indeed,
again,
absolutely,
you know,
yes.
where that massively changed because it was very emotional and very big, you know, and when you could sort of see some of those impacts, it made you react in a way that I think you weren't able to react on based on a logical argument or, you know, a campaign post or something like that, to see the real effect and to be able to sort of, I guess, relate in an animal way to other animals who were hurting as a result of what we were doing as humans. That's
true, and one of the key things again that we look at is this role of emotion in developing action and understanding amongst general publics. So we, for instance, think about the way in which science fiction novels can imagine environmental futures and can produce alternative futures which provide models for how we might want to live, or the way in which programs like Springwatch actually don't just provide, you know, senses of, oh, this is a wonderful thing, the countryside, but real knowledge which can feed into scientific data later on. And
yeah, no, that's fine. No, I was just, because we're getting a bit short on time, but I wanted to sort of touch on two things, really. One is that, you know, I guess those things are real examples, I guess, of how environment and society are very relevant and can relate on a range of, you know, local and global levels, etc. But within your module as well, DD213, you also introduce skills within each section, showing how students can look at various things, and those build in a really, really nice way. So not only are you looking at some of those issues, but some of the methods and ways of doing things are developed for students over time so that they are interrogating some of these ideas with different tools.
That's true. I mean, the module follows through in its 6 blocks: description, evaluation, investigation, and analysis. And what we do is, what we're very keen on is trying to develop independent study skills. And we do that through a thing which we call virtual fieldwork.
Oh, tell us about that.
Okay, you're right about virtual fieldwork.
But quickly, because
yes,
we have to then...
Okay, so the idea about virtual fieldwork is that we provide students with a toolkit, a package of materials based in a particular location to look at a particular problem. It's almost like a sort of investigator's toolkit. And they are maps, documents, interviews, photographs about a particular topic. And what we set them is a task to investigate with those. And it's all set within, we use a map, and you drill down through the map, and then there are 360-degree photo bubbles where you can spin round and imagine yourself standing on a hillside looking over a valley, or standing in a town centre looking round at the market square and all the various buildings and things. And then as you look, think about one's question, you can then click on different things and raise the various interviews and documents that are involved in understanding that part of the story, as if you were, as much as we can, as if one was an investigator at the site and was going and talking to somebody in the marketplace, as if one was in a village and you were talking to a farmer and then talking to the school teacher and then looking at a map which shows where the good land is and the bad land, or things like that.
And if I'm right, you've selected Greece as
yes.
the sort of the site, and then each block, where you mentioned before that you have the blocks of fire and cultural landscape, etc. So you're looking at various things within Greece.
That's right.
And
yes.
relating those to some of the key themes in each block. So each time people are returning to the same site, but with a different question in mind.
That's correct. So they start off by looking at the effects of the wildfires of 2007. And they move on from there to look at how the historic cultural landscape of Olympia was reconstructed after the fires, and then they move on to look at issues of the privatisation of beach space, and so on, till they get in Block 5 to look at the migration crisis and how Greece handles the migration crisis, and think about what an environmental migrant might be.
No, that's incredibly exciting, and I think so unique for students as well to be able to get that fieldwork example and to be able to collect all of those assets and look at things in a range of different ways, and also to look at some of those very topical issues, you know, and yeah, through a variety of lenses. George, that's been absolutely brilliant. We're out of time, unfortunately, but that's given us a wonderful flavour of the module, and I'm sure lots of students will be looking forward to studying it.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we're going to have a short video break now for about 20 minutes or so. And then this afternoon, we're going to come back to look at some of our postgraduate offerings, where we look at the MA in Philosophy and also the MA in Crime and Global Justice. So we'll be back live on air at 4:15. So go and grab a cup of coffee or tea, but you can enjoy the video breaks, which will showcase a range of different things that we've been talking about this afternoon. The chat box will remain open, and we'll collect any questions that you've got about postgraduate study when we return back on air at 4:15. I'll see you then.